gigantic sized suitcase full of Christmas presents, and they were not for me. I got a pair of pajama pants, and that was it. It's like she doesn't care about me anymore. They were all for Natalie and Zachary. One of the gifts that they got was this really nice wooden nativity set. And I didn't expect an awe on that one. And a central theme of this nativity set is this kind of stable or barn-looking thing where all the animals who are Jesus' first roommates kind of all hang out together. And this is pretty much in every nativity scene I've ever seen is this kind of stable or barn type of structure. The evidence for this in the Bible is pretty slim, actually. The only author who says anything about the kind of structure or building that Jesus was born in is Luke. And all that Luke says is that Jesus was wrapped and placed in a manger, which is a feeding trough, but it doesn't say anything about a stable or barn. And actually in the first century, a lot of homes had the animals staying in the main living kind of area. Like they had their own place, but it wasn't like a stable out back somewhere. So as far as I can tell, nativity scenes have it wrong. And I know everything that you've ever believed about Christmas is now rocked to the core. And I'm so sorry. Apologize. But this is just the truth, that the gospel writers didn't really care about the kind of structure in which Jesus was born. But sometimes the structure really does matter. Sometimes how something is built says a lot. So I did some architectural research this past week. I want to show you a few examples of structures that really give you a sense of what the purpose of a building is. So here's the first one. Next one. Not that. That's not a building. This is called the Burj Khalifa. Has anyone heard of it? This is the tallest building in the world by far. It's just a little bit taller than any other buildings in its neighborhood. It's over 800 meters tall, which is if you tilted it on its side, it would stretch from here all the way to Oak Street. This thing is enormous. And if you look at the structure and how big it is, it tells you something. It tells you that the people who built it wanted to make a name for themselves. Just like going back into Genesis, this is what people do, and this is what the people who built this say. They built it so that everybody would know the city of Dubai, and so that rich people would come and invest their money there. The structure gives you the sense of what this is about. Next example. This is the Air Force Academy Chapel in Colorado. Its structure is 17 spires, all in the shape of fighter jets. Crazy church building. And it's not really for any one religion in particular. There are chapels in it for all kinds of religions. But the one unifying factor is that it's for people in the American Air Force. Now, what the New Testament would have to say about this is for another day. But the point is, the structure gives you the sense of what this building is about. Last example. This was the headquarters of a company called Longabergers. And you'll never guess what Longabergers made. Computers. No, I'm just kidding. They made baskets. Yeah. They made baskets. And it's no coincidence that this building doubles as the biggest basket in the world. And then they moved. I don't know why they moved, but it's not their headquarters anymore. They've downgraded. The structure gives the sense. And when we come to this passage from Luke, when we come to these stories that Luke tells about the birth of Christ, that's it. We're good on the pictures now. We don't need to look at the basket. When we come to the stories that Luke tells about Christ, he maybe didn't care very much about the physical structure, but he gave a lot of detail to the structure in which he told the stories, the written structure. And I think if we come this morning to this text, we want to hear God's voice, right? I mean, most of us have some kind of conviction that this book, that the Bible, has truth to tell us, that God wants to speak to us through it. And if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention to the structure, we might just rush through something like Zechariah's song, and it will sound like a nice collection of ideas, but it won't make a whole lot of sense to us. But if we pay attention to the structure of the text, the structure that Luke gives it, I think we're actually going to hear some pretty important things that God has to say to us. So let's look more at this text, what the structure says to us. But first, let's give it some context. Throughout the Advent season, we've been walking through some of these stories that Luke tells before the birth of Christ. We've talked about especially this relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus, and between their mothers, between Mary, this young unwed virgin, and Elizabeth, this elderly lady who's been barren all her life, and how, at more or less the same time, both of them become miraculously pregnant. Both are visited by angels. The time comes in this passage where Elizabeth gives birth to her son, a boy. On the 8th day, there's a huge party, and this was customary in kind of Judaism. On the 8th day, they were going to circumcise the boy. It doesn't sound like much of a party for the 8-day-old, but for the rest of the people, it's a huge celebration. The neighbors and the relatives and all their friends come together. And one of the exciting things that happens at this party is that we get to know the name of the child. So I think this is maybe influenced by the Filipino culture. Everybody comes together and they say, let's name him together. Let's do this as a community thing. And they all say, let's name him Zechariah. That's the father's name. That should be the son's name too. We should continue on the tradition. But Elizabeth knows this is not just any child. This isn't anything customary about this. So she says, no, there's a different name. There's a name that God has given me to name him. That's the name John. John, which is kind of a commonplace name in our day, but back then it was not quite as common, and it meant that the Lord is gracious. So she says, that's the name. But they all say, no, what are you talking about? Who do you think you are? There's nothing appropriate about this. Let's see if Zechariah, the father, can talk some sense into her. Now, the only problem is that he can't talk. For 9 months, he has had his mouth sealed because, if you remember from a few weeks ago, when God announced to him the birth of his son, he wasn't quite sure about it. He doubted it a little bit, and this is God's judgment on him, is he can't talk for 9 months. So he can't talk sense into Elizabeth, but maybe he can write some sense into her. So they give him a tablet. He writes the name on there. And once the crowd sees it, they know that they've lost the argument. He as well insists that the name is to be John. Now, at this moment, this act of obedience, God reverses his judgment on Zechariah. All of a sudden, his mouth is opened. He can talk again. And I just wonder, if you put yourself in Zechariah's shoes, you have not been able to talk for 9 months. Some of you, that's beyond comprehension. And now, all of a sudden, for 9 months, you've been watching the pregnant belly of your elderly wife expanding, and you've heard the news about your relative Mary and her child, who's going to be called Son of God, whatever that could mean. And now you're holding in your hands a son that you never thought you would have. You had given up hope of having long, long ago. Here you are holding him. What are the first words that would come out of your mouth? It's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it? What would you say if for 9 months you hadn't been able to talk, you witnessed all of this, and all of a sudden the floodgates are open? Well, for Zechariah, there has been a reservoir of praise building up in him. I mean, he's not bitter about not being able to talk. God has done incredible things, and it just kind of bubbles up in him. It's been building up. It's like this pressure cooker that just kind of explodes. And that's Zechariah's song. Zechariah's song is just this explosion of praise for all that God has done. But see, here's the key. When Zechariah explodes, it's not like it's all just kind of incoherent nonsense. It's well thought out. There is a clear structure to it. So let's look at this. We've been talking about the structure for a while. Let's actually look at the structure. One of the keys to this passage is a bunch of key words that are repeated throughout. If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to keep them open to Luke 1 so you can kind of track with this. One of the key words starts right at the beginning. Luke 1:68, Zechariah says that God has come to his people. That word come is actually a bit more of a specific word that is often translated visit. God has visited his people. At the end of the song, Zechariah says it again, that the rising sun will come to us from heaven. Again, the word is visit. God's visitation repeated at the beginning and at the end of the song. Another word is salvation. Zechariah says in verse 69 that God has raised up a horn of salvation. Salvation from our enemies. And at the end of the song, in verse 77, he says that he is going to give people the knowledge of salvation. God's salvation repeated at the beginning and the end. Another word is mercy. The salvation at the beginning in verse 72 is said to be motivated by mercy, God's mercy shown to their ancestors. And then in verse 78, salvation has come because of the tender mercy of our God. God's mercy repeated at the beginning and the end. And by the way, I love that word, a tender mercy. The word tender is the Greek word splachna, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's something that comes from the deep down parts of you, from the guttural kinds of parts. God's mercy comes from the really deep down parts of who he is. And I just wanted to say the word splachna. Last word is the word prophet. This salvation has been spoken by the holy prophets of long ago, verse 70. And then in verse 76, Zechariah says that his child, John, will be a prophet, God's prophet beginning and end. You see, those key words kind of divide the song into two sections, verses 68 to 75 and verses 76 to 79. You get this cluster at the beginning, and then you get them all repeated at the end. But here's the key to it. The first section, Zechariah uses past tense verbs. It's all about what God has done. It's about his visitation in the past, about his salvation in the past, about his mercy in the past, about God, about his prophets that he spoke through in the past. It's about figures like Abraham and David, and he references Isaiah, those kinds of people. He's talking about what we call the Old Testament. It's about what God has done. Verses 76 to 79 shifts a little bit. All of a sudden now we've got future tense verbs. We've got news about what God is doing or will do. His visitation now, his mercy now, his salvation now. A prophet he's raising up now. 68 to 75, what God has done. 76 to 79, what God will do. And here's the big key. Here's the thing that ties it together, the thing that you need to remember from this morning. What God has done is the same as what he will do. That's the key words being repeated. That's what it says. What God has done, he will do. In a lot of ways, what's happening in John and in Jesus is nothing new. Now, of course, in some ways it was. Nobody expected God to take on flesh, to enter the world as a baby. Years later, nobody expected a man to be risen to eternal life in this world, in this era. But still, those are the kinds of things God has always been doing. He's always been visiting his people. He's always been bringing life out of death. God is consistent. His ways and his character are consistent. You can trust in him. You can rely on him because what he has done is what he will do. And for some of you this morning, this is a really important thing to know. It's Christmas time and we're all supposed to be happy and joyful and singing songs all the time. And some of you aren't. And that's okay. Like some of you, to use Zechariah's phrase, feel like you're sitting in darkness. And you in the balcony especially right now, you're sitting in darkness. You're going through this valley, this difficult time in life, and you don't know what God is doing. You're not sure where God is. You might even look at the world and you might not be sure what is God up to in all of this. I don't know what he's doing. It's great that he came to the earth 2,000 years ago. It's great that he died on the cross, but it's kind of like, what have you done for me lately? Some of you are in that place. And a lot of times if we look at our world, we can easily get into that place of just, God, what are you up to? What God has done, he will do. You can trust him. It may not be obvious right now, but he's the kind of God who visits his people. The kind of God who who has mercy, a kind of God who saves, a kind of God who speaks through people. That's who he's always been. That's who he was when Jesus came. That's who he is right now, and that's who he will be. You can trust that. He will deliver you because that's who he is. I may have told this story before, but years ago I was going through kind of a season of discouragement. I believed that God had called me to a place. I was at a church. I was a pastor there. And I just felt like I was dying. Like not literally. The people there weren't so bad. They were pretty good to me. It was metaphorically. I just felt like God had brought me there. And then he just kind of left me. And I experienced kind of failure and rejection. And I just didn't know where he was, what he was up to. And I was really struggling with this. And I remember I was at a Christian music festival. And I was particularly at a heavy metal screamo kind of concert, which is not the kind of, I actually don't really like that kind of music. But I was there because some of the teens wanted to be there. They liked that kind of music. But it was pretty incredible, actually. The lead singer was a guy who he talked about how Jesus had rescued him, and he would just start crying. Like, this was a guy who just loved Jesus. And as he started to lead this one song that was just the song of praise, kind of screaming praise to God, God spoke to me. He really did. He brought to my mind all kinds of examples of his faithfulness. He kind of took me, as I listened to the song, all of a sudden he was taking me through Abraham and David and Isaiah and Jesus and all these big figures and his faithfulness to all of them. And it was like he was telling me, look, Craig, I have been around for a lot longer than you. I'm an eternal God. I stretch from age to age. And this little slice of your life that you're struggling with, I mean, I am still who I've always been, and I will do in your life what I've always done in the lives of my people. And it was just this moment of confirmation that what God has done, those moments of, in the big picture, God's mercy shown through the cross, that he would do that in my life in the little picture of my life. In little ways, he would show that same kind of mercy to me. I have to say, in the 2 years that followed, I saw his salvation and his mercy in so many ways. What God has done in the big picture, taking your place on the cross, taking your shame, dying for you. He does that every day in small little ways. What God has done, he will do. You can trust him. To use another image, and kind of going with the concert thing again. Maybe you've been at a concert before where it's a great show. You love it. It's been an amazing experience. At the end, you don't want it to end. So you start chanting, encore, encore, encore. And sometimes the band comes out and they play another song. But I don't know about you, but most times when I've seen that, they don't play the same song they played before, right? They usually play a new song. But it's the same kind of music. Like they don't, the screamo band, they wouldn't all of a sudden break out into a country song or something like that. It's the same kind of music. It's the same qualities that have drawn you to that band that made this concert incredible in the first place. God doesn't do the exact same thing over and over again, but he does the same kind of thing because his character and his actions are consistent. He's the God of the encore. What he has done, he will do. But we can delve even further into the structure of Zechariah's song, because the structure reveals one more way in which what God has done, he will do. Look at who the song is addressed to. Right at the beginning, in verse 68, Zechariah starts by saying, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel." First part of the song is just all about God. It's all about his salvation, all about his greatness. It's entirely God-focused, God-centered. But in verse 76, there's a bit of a switch, isn't there? Who's addressed? If you have your Bible open, who's addressed in verse 76? It's John. All of a sudden now, this song of praise, now Zechariah shifts his focus and he talks about his son John. He says that his son John is going to be a prophet, that he's going to prepare the way for the Lord, he's going to give people knowledge of God's salvation. What we can take from that is that first and foremost, salvation is God's doing. It's all about him. It's his initiative. There is nothing that we human beings can do to earn it or deserve it. We didn't bring it about. The only involvement we had really was nailing Jesus to the cross. But this is all God's doing. It's his initiative. But the second part of the song tells us that despite it being all God's initiative, he genuinely wants to involve us. He genuinely invites our participation. And the structure of the song tells us that this is how God has always been. From the beginning, he could have wiped humanity out, but he could have saved humans single-handedly. He could have just said, this is happening whether you like it or not. I'm going to fix all your hearts. I'm going to make you do good. I'm going to make you love me. But he didn't do that. No, he consistently invites us to join him in the work he wants to do in our lives and in our world. So he goes to a guy like Abraham who lied about his wife being his sister, and he says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you and make you a blessing. He goes to a guy like David who sleeps with a married woman and kills her husband and repents, but still he goes to a guy like that and he says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. One of your descendants are always going to be on the throne. He works through people like John the Baptist. I don't know particularly what faults John had besides questionable dietary decisions, eating locusts all the time. I don't know about that. But I guarantee you, he was a frail, fallen, broken human being. And God said, I'm going to work through you. I'm going to prepare the way through you. That's what God has always done. His merciful visiting salvation. He's done it with people. And he continues to do it today. Through people like us. Through you. So if you're this morning just not sure what is your purpose in life, what does God want to do with you? Sometimes you might feel like you're just supposed to be a passive recipient. Maybe some of you said a prayer once to become a Christian and nobody told you what to do after that. Like now you've said the prayer, you got baptized, there's nothing else. Well, that's not true. God is inviting you to join him in his work in the world. That's what he's always done. That's what he continues to do. I think about it like this. If I invite my 3-year-old daughter, Natalie, to do some kind of work with me, to maybe do a household chore like washing the dishes, which I do once every few weeks or so. If I invite her to do that with me, do you know what she says? She's really excited to do it, to wash the dishes with me. I don't think it's because she loves washing dishes. I think it's because she's my kid and she wants to be with me. She wants to do what I'm doing. Now, I know that's going to wear off a decade from now, if not earlier, and it'll lay dormant for a long time. But right now, that eagerness and that joy that she has in just being with me, doing what I'm doing, that to me is what a picture of what God's relationship with us is like. That's God's desire for us as his kids to just come alongside him and do the kinds of things he's doing, to join him in his work. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, we could spend a lot of time on that. But first of all, I think it actually means that we are called to exercise faith. That by God's power and strength still, we need to respond to his gracious initiative in salvation. He's come to visit us, but he actually wants us to respond. We're not just passive recipients here. We actually say, yes, God, we need you. We need what you have to give us because we're broken and weak. That act of faith is part of joining God in his saving work. But it goes beyond that. Because once we've been saved by grace, Jesus says, come along with me. Be in relationship with me. Do the things I'm doing. I want to love these people. I want to love your enemies. Will you come and love your enemies with me? He says, I want to heal this broken place in the world. I want to go into this broken part of your world, and I want to do some stuff there. Will you come and join me? He says, I want to let people know who I am. I want to let people know what I've done for them. Will you come along and join me? Will you come and speak with me to people about who I am, about what I've done? That's the invitation of Jesus to you, to come and to join him in his work. He could do it on his own. He'd probably do it a lot better if it was on his own than dealing with us. But it's his good pleasure as our Father to invite us along with him. What God has done, he will do, and he wants to do it with you. And this Christmas, just one more kind of thing, just to connect what we did here at the beginning of the service. At the end of the song, Zechariah says that this child is going to announce the salvation of God, and that through this, he's going to guide our feet into paths of peace. We lit the candle of peace. I want to say this is just one more area in which what God has done, he will do, and he wants to do it with you. He wants to bring peace to the world. He wants to bring peace between you and God, and then he wants to bring peace between you and others, and he wants to bring peace between you and creation, and he wants to bring peace between other people and other people, and all of those things. And he's saying, I want to do that with you. And Christmas, let's be honest, sometimes doesn't feel like a very peaceful time. Depending on the kind of family that you have. I know my family Christmases weren't always very peaceful growing up. And the chaos out there, sometimes if you go to a mall, that's anything but peaceful. This is not necessarily the season of peace. But Jesus is calling you to join him in the work of bringing peace, of being a person of peace, of proclaiming peace in your life. And so as we go from here, this is kind of like my sending to you, as we go into this last week before Christmas, a week that in some ways is the most chaotic of the year, will you join Jesus in doing what he's always done, is doing, and will do, which is to bring deep, abiding peace between you and our Father, between you and others, between you and creation. What exactly that looks like in your life, you probably want to pray about and spend some time with Jesus. But I think that's our invitation this coming week. So, what God has done, he will do, and he wants to do it with you. That's the structure of Zechariah's song. That's the structure of our life. That's who God is, and that's good stuff. Amen. Let's sing a song of respect.